Today we're going to talk about wort production and drink some sort of darker British beers. So we're going to start off with a mild. This was supposed to be Banks's mild, but I've somehow managed to end up with Thwaites' mild. So I'm going to rely on the guys to tell me more about the real mild. And there's a few other different milds out there. So we'll be talking about mild in general.
Yeah, I've got Holden's from Dudley.
So all from that sort of area nowadays. There's a few more up around us in the Manchester area.
Yeah, Woodsetton, apparently.
Okay, so as usual, I'll just read a few bits out while we get into a glass. So for aroma, we're expecting low to moderate malt aroma, may have some fruitiness. Malt expression can take on a wide range of character, can include caramel, toffee, grainy, toasted, nutty, chocolate, lightly roasted, little no hop aroma, earthy or floral if present, low to no diacetyl. Okay, so who would like to talk about theirs first?
Well, I have Banks's mild in a 500 milliliter big can, which it proudly wears. Yeah, so the aroma I put moderate malt with caramel and bready notes. I also put dates and plums in the aroma. No hops. Medium low fruity esters. I guess that would be the plums. And then I just started listing the no things. No ethyl heat. I can't say that. No alcohol. No DMS.
Yeah, I'm struggling to really smell very much at the moment, but I did get a little bit. Going back to the dark fruits that you mentioned and a bit caramel. Almost when I first smelled it, reminded me a bit of like Christmas cake, the fruit cake. It's dark. I mean, it's got kind of red highlights. Got well, mine's got sort of a light tan head. Seems to last fairly well. Looks mostly small bubbles, quite creamy looking. So.
Moving on to flavour. Generally a malty beer, though many have very wide range of malt, yeast and yeast-based flavours. Malty, sweet, caramel, toasty, nutty, chocolate, coffee, roast, fruit, licorice, plum and raisin. Can finish sweet to dry. Versions with darker malts may have a dry roasted finish. Low to moderate bitterness, enough to provide some balance, but not enough to overpower the malt. Fruity esters, moderate to none. Who'd like to start on this one?
Yeah, I was going to say, because I mean, we said with the aroma we talked about, getting the fruit there. I sort of said it reminded me of like a Christmas cake, fruit cake. But I don't get any of that in the flavour. I don't, or at least, I mean, again, I'm drinking a different one, but there's none of. I don't get any of the fruit in the flavour. It's more like dark chocolate. With some roast notes. It's got moderate bitterness, maybe a little bit below that, and it finishes very dry. And there's no noticeable alcohol flavour, which is not surprising. It's mild. It's meant to be very low alcohol.
Yeah, quite a lot of these. I know the one I've got goes much more into the coffee and chocolate in the flavour, and it's much fruitier in the aroma. Anyone else got thoughts on the flavour?
Well, I've got the Bankses. I think the Bankses is a good example for what mild is, which is less bitter than bitter. Because I think most people would call the Bankses mild. You could call it bitter and get away with it because it's not dark and it hasn't got the fruit cake like one of them. It's not intensely dark. It is just like they're bitter, but a touch darker and a touch less bitter. And I think that is sort of the essence of mild, because you can get strong milds, of course, can't you? I'm suddenly gone speechless over the bit I know about Banks's mild because I grew up drinking it.
I mean, there's a range of colours in milds in general. I mean, there used to be in the previous version of the styles was a separate pale mild, which has sort of actually died out in production more or less now. And the Banks is on the lighter end of the colour from memory. Yeah, copper to dark brown or mahogany. A few paler examples exist. Generally clear, though traditionally unfiltered, low to moderate off-white to tan head. So, I mean, the one I've got on the darker end there, I'd have called that sort of ruby, dark, moderate brown. The bitterness is low to moderate, whereas a bitter would probably be at least moderate. I think it's interesting this one to talk a little bit about the mouthfeel. Any thoughts on that?
I think the Banks's one is there's quite a lot of carbonation there, and in the absence of any strong flavours, particularly there's not much in the way of dark fruit or anything like that. It's very noticeable, the high carbonation level, but that might just because it's come from a can, perhaps.
Yeah,
and it's a budget beer.
There's obviously a variation in carbonation between that and the cask version of it, if you ever see that anymore. So yeah, these will go up to medium body, but it's pretty rare. Most of them will be right at the light end because there's just not much of anything to them. With the stronger ones, you tend to enter those as a historical style, because that's really they sort of reflect not what the commonly brewed mild is, though one of the one of the beers that used to be called the mild no longer is. Was up at 6%. The Sarah Hughes. I think it's just called Ruby now rather than Ruby Mild. But there we go. Any more thoughts on this beer?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to agree. I mean, certainly with this one, again, this is the Holdens. I think the carbonation is sort of in the medium range, but it feels a lot more because it's such a light body beer, and it does almost feels I don't know, it feels a little out of place to me. And that's probably in sort of in the feedback section. That's probably what I would say is, yeah, look at lowering carbonation, or because it does kind of wipe out the body almost.
Yeah, what little body there is to start with in most of these beers, yeah, carbonation certainly doesn't help if it's too high. Okay, so while we sip at that one, I'm going to talk a little bit about recipes and recipe creation. A lot of this is going to concentrate more on what can go wrong. I mean, all of you know how to brew beer, so I'm not going to go into too many details of what the process is. And in a couple of areas, when we get further into the wort production, real wort production side of it, I'll talk a little bit of the chemistry, but mostly I'm going to assume you sort of basically know which enzymes we're talking about and what they're up to. That's fairly common stuff, and concentrate more on what the impact on actually judging beer will be. So a little bit intro on recipes and what sort of things can go wrong there to start with. Obviously, recipes come from all over the shop. There's well-known pro brewers publish them as books. There's online ones. You can create your own. Everyone knows the tools. But when you're judging, you're actually going to end up making a guess about what their recipe is. You don't know what their recipe was. So whatever you say about it, you probably want to couch it in some sort of maybe, perhaps, if you did this, then maybe you want to do that sort of terminology. You may be absolutely certain that they sparged it with cold water for 4 weeks, but there was a no sparge beer or something. You always, as soon as the more assumptions you make, that's where you're likely to get people whinging, trying to come back, which they're quite allowed to come back and talk to you. They do have your email address. Don't very often, but try to be general and positive in the feedback here. So things that usually go wrong in recipe creation, grain selection, starting there. Incorrect choices of grain. I've had a few cases, especially in the roast beers, where people have assumed that all dark malts are the same. So have subbed out black malt for chocolate or vice versa. and or at least appear to have done. And some of them, when they come back, they've said that they did do something like that. They had a recipe and they'd swapped black pattern malt in for chocolate because they didn't have any, and it came out quite astringent. That was no surprise. Other ones you often run across people who've chucked in far too much caramel and crystal. It used to be very, very trendy to chuck in quite a lot, and so some people still do. And you can end up with some beers that are just caramel bombs. You can hint that they put too much in, but just try and be polite about it. Other things go wrong. They get stale malts. Once again, a fairly rare one, but you can end up with grassy or even metallic flavors from stale malts. You wouldn't often call that out. You probably just talk about the grassy or metallic flavors because they have many possible sources. Inappropriate use of adjuncts is another one you quite commonly you get people substituting in something like flake maize for something else. You end up in a light beer in a lager or something, and you can end up with corny flavors in there. That one's fairly easy to pull out. The other side of that is too much rye or oats or whatever. You can end up with a beer that tastes as a mouthfeel of sort of grease, which can be quite unpleasant. It comes out quite often in rye beer, so that's often a one you have to be quite polite in feeding back. So slightly less rye, please. Even if the flavour's not overpowering, sometimes the mouthfeel can be. Hop selection is another area where people do some unusual things that, when you are targeting a style, don't really work. They may work just as a beer, in which case you should suggest they enter it in a different category. But they may just not work at all. Some obvious selection issues, things like citrus hops and claiming it's a European lager is a bit unexpected, or in some cases people just put in vast quantities of hops, leading to grassiness. The hop combos, it's difficult to challenge them as being wrong. You just have to say the flavors are a bit unusual. Like sriracha in almost anything, but that's personal taste. You have to be very aware of personal taste. Old hops is another one. Some of you guys were at the Chorlton homebrew thing a couple of weeks back with the Sierra Nevada clones with ancient hops. Some of those, are due to the quantities put in, have gone quite grassy and had no hop flavour. Fortunately, none of them have gone cheesy, which was nice. Which is the one of the signs. Hops with age will go cheesy for a little bit, and then we'll usually just go to being grassy and stale, and grassy primarily, and not having any hop flavour and giving a little bit of bitterness if you're lucky. Obviously those are the hops if you're making a lambic that you want, because you're just after some of the antibacterial qualities, but still trying not to kill off your lacto, which is very easy to do. Other things you might mention when talking back, giving feedback from recipe is maybe something about minerals. This is another rare one to mention unless they've either put vast quantities in and you can start tasting chalkiness, which you can suggest maybe mineral additions, or sometimes when you're just giving light advice to tweak a beer, you can talk about things like the sulfite chloride balance for IPAs and other beers. So if you're getting harsh bitterness, you could say, look at your sulfite chloride ratio, that ratio. Sulfate for hops, chloride for malt, if I get it the right way around. You might mention that as something to look at, but obviously you don't know that that's the cause of the problem. So you need to be pretty suggesting something rather than being dogmatic and saying you definitely need to do this. One of the big things you sometimes get odd, you could occasionally talk about, is the yeast selection. Most of the actual off flavors from yeast will come from fermentation, which I'm going to talk about next time. And it's usually fairly unlikely that the brewers picked something really wacky, but you do sometimes get cases where you get some Belgian flavors, some phenolics and spicy things in a beer that's not supposed to have it. You can suggest moving category or looking at the yeast selection there, but that may just be a yeast health thing. What else have we had? Yeah, for some occasionally you have things where there are what seem to be purposeful wild yeasts in them in a non-wild category. It's usually polite to assume they put them on purpose and it's not an infection, unless it's something very obvious. Okay. Other things about recipes. Yeah, so yeah, you can make quite a lot of suggestions about changing up the recipe, changing the ratios of grains and the like. But once again, the big thing to be clear here is that you don't know. You may get to see a recipe afterwards. Some people do provide the recipes on their entry details, and you can go and have a look at them afterwards, but you won't know what they are while judging. Okay, so before we get into the actual technicalities of making some wort, let's drink some porter. So first one we'll go for the Taddy porter. Let me just find English porter, which should be on the next page, and I'll read out the aroma section. Moderate to moderately low bready, biscuity and toasty malt aroma with mild roastiness. May have a chocolate quality. May also show some non-roasted malt character and support. Caramelly, nutty, toffee-like and or sweet. May have moderate level of floral earthy hops. Fruity esters, moderate to none. Diacetyl, low to none. Okay, so I think some people have filled in score sheets for this one.
Yeah,
Who'd like to go first?
I filled in it. So I had it down as low to medium sweet caramel. I put down there was a hint of raisin fruitiness there, so had it down as low esters. Actually the medium to high sweetness, I said it was more the sweet caramel that I was picking up as well. Low roast, low hop aroma. There was a slight alcohol note initially when I first smelled it that sort of subsides as you sort of get used to it. Yeah, it's just the usual no phenols and
Yeah.
and there's chocolate coming through as well.
Cool. Anyone else?
I'm actually getting some alcohol off there. It seems strange for 5%, but on raisins.
I think raisins seems to be a common one here. I mean, I've got medium dark toffee, some milk chocolate, and some raisins forming the core of the aroma. Some fruit loaf-like notes in the toffee, adds more sugary notes. Slight hint of tobacco smoke. Diacetyl, no DMS, no diacetyl. So I think I'm more or less agreeing with most of you there. I've got a bit more on the estery side of things, but
I don't know if it's the same with everyone else. I'm not necessarily picking up alcohol, but mine's got a slight kind of banana or dried banana note to it. Which I've had this beer loads of times. I've never noticed that before, so maybe it's this bottle.
I think I might be able to pick that as well. I wonder if it's because we bought the same bottles, both bottles from the same place. But, oh yeah, it's definitely got that boozy hit to it, and that sort of dark chocolate, raisiny, malted milk thing going on.
there's all good descriptive terms for it. While we're here, let's have some any thoughts on appearance.
Well, it's pretty black. You can hardly see through it with a tan white head and the fine white fine bubbles on it as well for the head. It seems to be persistent a little bit longer than last time when I tasted it, which is good. Wasn't very persistent the first time on the pour.
Yeah, mine appears to be better than it was first time because I said moderate head that fades fast. Yeah, colour is dark reddish brown. Very good clarity.
Perhaps that's now it's warmed up a little bit.
Moving on to the flavour. We have moderate bready, biscuity, toasty malt flavour, including mild, moderate roastiness, frequently with a chocolate character, often with significant caramel, nutty, and/or toffee character. May have secondary flavours such as coffee, licorice, biscuits, or toast in support. Should not have significant burnt or harsh roast flavour, although small amounts may contribute a bit of chocolate complexity. Earthy or floral hop flavour, moderate to none. Medium low, most hop bitterness. Medium low to medium hop bitterness will vary the balance slightly. Malts to slightly bitter. Usually fairly well attenuated, though can be somewhat sweet. That's still moderate low to none. Moderate to low fruity esters. Who'd like to start us off here?
Yeah, so I had it down as low to medium sweetness with a dry finish, a low to medium bitterness, hints of caramel, and then I put potentially well attenuated as well. But I didn't really put too many descriptors there.
Anyone else got any thoughts on the flavour?
There's some demerara sugar there. There's certainly some esters in there, but they're not too. So only moderate there. Maybe a little breadiness, and coming back to when I said the aroma had like alcohol and raisins. Again, I'd say the flavour is like, or maybe someone soaked some raisins in alcohol. It's it's very much that, quite rich.
Yeah, I've gone with flavour follows around with mod loaf notes, moderate chocolate and some dark toffee and caramel. Mixed in is a medium level of dried fruit, raisins and prunes. Medium bitterness that balances well, but it's not a lingering bitterness. No this, no that, the other. I'm getting this time maybe a little bit more smokiness, a bit more roastiness than I did when I wrote that out. So how does this compare mouthfeel wise with the first beer?
It's definitely a fuller mouthfeel than the first one. It's not quite up there with a stout or something, but it's sort of on the above medium. But
yeah,
I think certainly on my one it seems to be either a lower carbonation or at least it feels lower because there's more body to counteract that. So, but yeah, I mean it's maybe a very low astringency, but not excessive and not out of character. Yeah, I mean other than that, yeah, quite nice. A little bit of alcohol warming, but not a lot. But it's you can definitely tell there's more alcohol than the mild.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting comparison with the first one, just to get more feel of what low and medium, somewhere in medium body, what they're like relative to each other.
See, that's where probably because I didn't do the mild before writing this down, is I actually had this as a light body. I was quite surprised at how light it was actually. Yeah.
I mean, this you could acceptably call that medium, maybe somewhere in medium. I think it's not like a full body impy stout or something. Even to medium low will be fine. I think of the description of that. Mouthfeel's always a bit tricky because it's quite subjective. Well, all of this is very subjective.
I just wanted to ask, going back to flavour for a minute. It says moderate in this style guide, and that, I mean, if that's moderate, I'd like to know what kind of full flavoured is, because it's it's pretty potent stuff. It's not I wouldn't call that a moderate flavour. I was wondering, is that out of style, or is that what moderate is?
I think the moderate refers to the bready, biscuity, or toasty, moderate roastiness. But then you have significant caramel, nutty, and toffee. So there's a fair amount of flavour in it. I'll agree. Right, as we sip onto that, I'm going to talk a little bit about mashing and recirculation, sparge, and all of those sorts of things. This is going to cover techniques a bit more than the previous bit did, but we'll also go into what can go wrong. Couple of ways that people get water into their mash. I suspect all of you use one of 2 or 3 different methods. People either put the water in first, then chuck the grains in, or they mix them together as they pour them in, or some people underlet, in which they put the grains in first, then push the water in from underneath. These really make very little difference to what the beer in the end comes out like. It's just how your equipment works. A mash will end up with a pH. Usually you want to aim for a pH between 5.1 and 5.5. That may be one of those questions you'll get in the multiple choice one. And you can measure this. Even the cheap pH meters work fine at a brewery level of accuracy. One thing that's definitely worth knowing is about dark malts and pH. Dark malts pull the pH down, which are commonly known. So it's worth adjusting for those. Interestingly, someone did an experiment with an all black malt mash. Obviously, it didn't convert or anything, and that had a pH of around 4. Whereas I think it was all crystal, ended up about 6 or so. Experiments around mash pH show that it has less impact on the actual beer than we expect it to. It may have some impact on efficiency, which will be more important at larger scales. At a homebrew level, so long as you're in the vague range, you're fine. Another thing people worry about a lot is the thickness of their mash. Once again, makes much less difference than people expect. You have people doing brew in a bag, which is basically as runny as you can get. And then some people run quite thick. The main thing that affects, once again, is efficiency. When you're really thick, you get lower efficiency. I'll talk a bit more about temperatures in a minute, but once again, one element of feedback you'll do fairly often is about mash temp in the section, the feedback section. So you can talk about the high and low mash temps, giving a bit more body stroke residual sugars in a beer. But one thing to be very aware of, you probably shouldn't talk about numbers too precisely, especially with your own brewing. Remember, all thermometers are only as accurate as you last calibrated them. So a lot of people actually mash very different temperatures than they think they're mashing at. And it, once again, experiments seem to show at the moment it makes less difference than people think. So once you've started getting the water and grain in, you've got a series of rest temperatures to go through. It's worth knowing about all of these, though most of them you won't use. First rest temperature is your acid stroke glucan rest, which is around 35 to 45 C. You have a couple of enzymes here, phytase and beta glucanase. Phytase is really only there in very low killed, undermodified, old style malt, so probably doesn't do much. It can change the acidity of your malt, your mash, but once again, this is something you tend to do if you have some really heritage malted malt or something really you don't really know about the quality of. The beta glucanase is supposed to break down glucans that can cause haze or possibly stuck mashes. Once again, with modern, properly modified malts, this shouldn't be too much of a problem. If you're repeatedly having very hazy beers and you aren't just making modern IPAs, it might be worth thinking about, but it's very rarely necessary. Next rest is commonly called the protein rest at 44 to 59 C. Is that right? Yeah. The evidence at the moment says this probably doesn't have much to do with protein, but this is what actually could be happening. No one's really sure what's actually happening, or if anything is actually happening with modern, fully modified malt. So there's a proteinase enzyme that works on longer chain proteins, chopping them down into medium chain ones. And then we have peptidase enzymes, chopping the moderate ones down to short chains and breaking them down to their components. You need to, if you're going to do one of these rests, you need to be quite careful. I haven't written down which way round you need to be quite careful. I believe you need to head towards the top end of the temperature range because a lot of proteins, you want to keep some of these proteins in beer for head formation and head retention. So if you're going to do this tool, probably keep it at the upper end of that range, closer to over 50, possibly even above 55. That, I believe, favours proteinase, but I could be wrong, and I haven't written it down. That rest happens quite often. There's another rest you sometimes get in there for wheat beers to try and push their precursors for 4-vinyl guaiacol one way or the other. So you go either clovey or to the more fruity end of the flavors, but I've left that one out. You can go and look it up if you feel need. Unlikely to be questioned on that one. So now we get to the big one. Conversion. This is where we actually make beer. There are actually 3 enzymes in action here, but 2 of them we commonly talk about. The alpha and beta amylase. Alpha likes temperature around 68 to 75 and chops up big starches in soluble components, and our beta amylase like say 54 to 65 and knocks single sugars off, well, pairs of sugars off the end, giving you maltose. Obviously we don't want to have all of either of those, so our usual mash range is 63 to 69. The effect of being 1 degree one way or the other is pretty limited, but if you're right at one end of that range, it will give you a different beer than right at the other end, probably. Though once again, there are some experiments showing this mightn't be the case, but it appears to actually happen like that. This rest with modern malts really doesn't necessarily need to be longer than about 40 minutes. Though an hour is probably safe, and some people go longer. It shouldn't make much difference how long you go. You can do the conversion tests at the end, checks at the end with things like your brown stuff.
Iodine.
That's the stuff. It's iodine. But once it's probably worth it. Beginning brewers do that a couple of times just to check they're converting at all. But once you're happy with your mash, not many people do that anymore. You get to know how it works. I'm sure you all do. Final step you might ask about is bash out. So we're trying to get over 72, probably up close to 76 to stop all enzyme activity. Once again, not entirely necessary for a thinner beer style. But if you're trying to make something chunky, you want to get your enzymes stopped. But we all know we've all covered most of this before. So we've got onto mash, covered the basics of mashing very briefly. So issues, things that could go wrong. The obvious things that you'll start giving feedback about the mash for are if the body of the beer is wrong. Could be a recipe thing, could be a mash temp thing. If it's too sweet or too dry, you could suggest the brewer looks at changing the mash profile. You would probably once again try and be a little vague about this. Maybe say something like upping the mash temperature by a degree or 2. You tend to couch this in a lot of perhaps languages. If the beer is very hazy and it's not a style where that's appropriate, you could start talking about the other rests. But that was rarely be the cure for that. That will probably come into our later stages where that's a problem. Okay, we all carry on with the beer brewing process. The terminology thing about the next stage is probably worth making clear about. When we're getting the wort out of the mash, there's two terms here you'll hear. There's lautering and sparge, and there's a couple of others as well. Lautering is the whole process, is getting the wort out of the mash, getting all the sugar out, whereas sparge is the adding the extra water part. So you will still lauter even if you're doing a no sparge process. It's all worth being clear at this point that lots of people will use lots of different techniques here. So it's difficult to make an assumption of what they've done and how to change it. So some people will be batch sparging, so just draining everything out and chucking a new batch of water in. Some people may be doing a no sparge technique. It's becoming quite popular, especially among stronger beers. Only for homebrewers, really, because we can not have to spend money on our malt and get away with a lower efficiency. Some people have got a jug and a sieve, or some tinfoil with holes in it, or fancy spinny sparge arms or constant recirc systems. So it's difficult to make any assumptions about what people are doing here. So once again, you need to be a bit general about what you're suggesting. You're unlikely to mention the initial recirculation or Vorlaff stage, where people are just taking wort out and bottom and chucking it back in the top much, unless there's obviously bits of grain floating around in the beer, which is just a bit weird after you've been through the boil and all the other parts of the process. But I've known it to happen primarily with kettle soured beers, where they haven't had a boil. People have left grain in either from this part of the process, or they've been trying to inoculate the beer with lactobacillus off grain, and they've left a load of grain in it, which is a pretty strange thing to find in a bottle of beer. You might mention sparging as a cause of astringency. So obviously, as you add more water to the beer, all your buffering stuff that keeps your pH at the right point starts to get drained out. So your pH starts to go up. Also, if you're sparging too hot, over say about 77, I think the number is C, you can start to get tannin extraction, which gives you astringency. So if you get an astringent beer, you might want to mention things like sparge temperature, being something to look at. But once again, you need to be very couch it in a lot of maybe terms, because you don't know what their process is. Okay, anyone want to add any thoughts they have about mash and recirculation before we try some more beer? American Porter. Aroma. Medium light to medium strong dark malt aroma, off with a lightly burnt character. Optionally may show some additional malt character and support. Grainy, bready, toffee-like, caramelly. Chocolate, coffee, rich and or sweet. Hop aroma, low to high, often with resiny, earthy, floral character. Maybe dry hopped, fruity esters, moderate to none. Okay, who'd like to go first?
Yeah, I don't mind going first. I put medium strong. Oh, that's the wrong word, isn't it? Anyway, medium strong aroma of burnt sugar, caramel, bready and rich malt, a touch of chocolate and roasted grain, with a low spicy hop note, and then no esters, no alcohol, no etc.
I could definitely go with the medium strong, roasty aromas, maybe with a bit of coffee. Some dark toffee caramels. There's some fruity esters in there. I think I'm getting some raisiny type, maybe some sort of toasted tea cakey type aroma, and not much in the way of hop. Maybe a little bit of floral, maybe. I mean, the sort of comparison here with with the English porter, it's more bitter and stronger and more dark malt qualities. So pulling out those dark malt notes is very, very much to the style. Okay. Any thoughts on appearance?
The head's much more persistent than any of the other bottles so far.
Yeah, I was going to sort of note having the English and American side by side. Their colours are actually surprisingly similar. Well, not surprisingly similar. They're very similar. There's slight differences in head colour and form, but they're quite similar in colour. Should we move on to the flavour? What we have here is moderately strong malt flavour. Usually features a lightly burnt character, and sometimes chocolate and or coffee flavours, with a bit of grainy, dark malt dryness in the finish. Overall flavour may finish from dry to medium sweet. May have some sharp character from the dark roasted grains, but should not be overly acrid, burnt or harsh. Medium to high bitterness may be accentuated by the dark malt. Hop flavour can vary from low to high, with resiny, earth and floral character balances the dark malt flavours. Dark malt and hops should not clash. Dry hop versions may have a resiny flavour. Fruity esters moderate to none. Okay, who'd like to start us off?
I don't mind going. I don't mind going in it again. I put bready, rich malt leading to dark sugar, treacle, burnt brown sugar, raisins, toffee, and toffee and chocolate covered raisins.
Good set of terms there. I think the one thing I'd add there is trying to get a level on those. So if you can go medium or high or low on a group of them, that's always a good thing to do. Yeah, I'd agree with pretty much all of them. I'm not sure I get chocolate raisins, but I certainly get chocolate and raisins, which I suppose is the same thing. I mean, I'd probably pull out some more coffee as well in that. And finishing with a medium high bitterness, accentuated by the dark malts. Okay, well, let's keep drinking that for a bit, and we'll go on to the rest of the Wort production. Then there's a few other bits to cover, and we'll get to the end. Okay, so what's the boil for? I think most of us basically know what it's for. We're extracting, isomerizing, and dissolving the alpha acids. We're stopping enzymatic activity if we haven't done that with a mash out. It kills the bacteria, fungi, and any wild yeast. Coagulates proteins and polyphenols, which is your hop break. Evaporates some hop oils, sulfur compounds, ketones, some esters, DMS potentially. Can promote the formation of melanoidins and caramelizes some wort sugars, though how much it does this is fairly questionable, unless you're doing something complicated with it, like taking a section of the mash off and boiling it down to a syrup separately. Obviously, it evaporates water vapor, reducing your volume and increasing your gravity, which is sort of a side effect, not really the reason you do it. You're probably better with less water, be cheaper. I think we sort of all understand how the boil works. It's worth having a brief look at alpha acid isomerization and the chemistry of it. I'll put a link below because it's much easier to do with some diagrams than it is just by talking about it. But I don't think knowledge of the details is relevant for judging. It's worth knowing things about the isomerization of alpha acids and the various other hop compounds may come up in the multiple choice exam. But obviously, that's something we can revise for. So where's it relevant for judging? Well, we've already mentioned the first one that always leaps out at people is DMS. Really, this is the one thing that's fundamentally boil related. There are a few other ways to get DMS into a beer, but primarily the first thing, if you find a beer with cooked corn, cooked veg flavors in it, you'll start talking about the boil, covered boils, letting the steam out, making sure you have a rolling boil, making sure it's a vigorous boil, and so on. Once, as usual, you can't know the people's process, but you really have to go in that direction at that point, start talking about that kind of thing. Another thing you may talk about at the boil is hop addition timing. You may say increase late additions or reduce the bittering addition if you're way out on the bitterness level. In particular, if maybe you may want to start mentioning cooling time, but we'll come on to that in a minute, about when your hops stop bittering the beer. Other things you might talk about within the boil, you talk about the vigorousness of it, the other hop addition timing. So if there's loads of hop aroma but no flavor, talk about hop flavor additions and their timing. But once again, you're being pretty vague about this. You say looking at perhaps increasing the hop additions around the 10 to 20 minute period, for example. Another thing that might come up is fining. So if you have a cloudy beer or a really hazy beer, it might be worth mentioning kettle finings, but it's fairly uncommon. We have had an example where someone put in so much isinglass it tasted really oddly of fish. This was a starting brewer who misread, I think it was grams into ounces. So we put in like 5 ounces of isinglass dissolved in water, and it tasted slightly of fish, which was really odd. We found out what he'd done afterwards. So that once again, that's a one-off. Other things that could happen in the boil, if you get a load of strange burnt sugar things, that can be due to overboiling or possibly boil over. Once again, pretty rare to find. But often you won't find an awful lot more you can say about the boil, apart from DMS. Cooling is another area we'll talk about a little bit. Cooling speed is one of the ones you tend to talk about most. But first, you need to be a little bit aware of the variety of things people are doing here. Obviously, a lot of homebrewers can chill quite quickly, but how much impact this has is questionable. I mean, all our professional friends cool quite slowly relative to a homebrew kit because they have so much volume. And the bigger pro ones are doing things like whirlpools at hot temperatures and so on while they're cooling. There are also a bunch of people who don't chill at all. These are mostly Australians, it appears, or there's a chunk in Southern America as well who do it quite a lot because their water is expensive and rare and they live in a permanent drought. So these guys basically finish their boil, drop it into a jerry can, seal it up and leave it overnight to cool down. Apparently this works quite well. Never tried a beer that's been made this way, but it could be an interesting experiment one time. Also, yeah, different people chill in different ways. So people in the small volume may just be sticking their pan in a sink of ice water. To people with immersion chillers, to counterflow chillers, to all sorts of complicated stuff. There's some people will be trying to stop the chilling at various temperatures to try and get some more hop flavor or aroma into the beer, usually around 70°C or so, where you're supposed to theoretically stop getting hop bitterness extraction. The evidence seems to say at the moment there is still some hop bitterness extraction going on at these temperatures. So it may be something to talk about, is how fast people are cooling and when they're stopping. But still, you obviously don't know what's going on. One of the other things you're doing while cooling is trying to get a cold break. Some people like removing it, some people don't. Once again, there's evidence either way, whether you get sterols for the yeast, or you can get esters and maybe chill haze from that. If you do have a beer with chill haze, that might be one thing to look at. To mention is perhaps cold break removal, because that's potentially a cause of chill haze. Okay, so at this point, you're trying to get your beer into your fermenter, and people have different ways of doing this. I'm going to cover a little bit more of this next time. But I'm going to leave this at the point where we've got the wort in the fermenter and we've got some oxygen in it. So people have different techniques at this point. Some people will just drop their wort from a great height into their fermenter. Some people will carefully transfer it over under CO2 pressure and do all sorts of complicated things. Some people have siphons, some people have taps, but none of this really makes much difference. One thing you may be relevant, that will become more relevant when we're talking about fermentation, is the oxygenation process people use. So a lot of home brewers, myself currently included, just go for a technique of causing vigorous splashing as the wort goes into the fermenter to get oxygen into it and hoping that to get some air into it. Some people have aquarium pumps. Some people have canisters of oxygen. Some people just vigorously shake their fermenter. All of these techniques have different levels of oxygen you can get into the beer. This is from memory because, once again, I haven't written it down. The shaking straight dropping techniques all drop out at about half the oxygen part per million level you get from a pure O2 bottle. For most beers and most yeasts, this is plenty. But for a high alcohol beer, you may need to do extra shaking or get some oxygen. The lack of oxygen will show up as yeast stress, which is something we'll talk about next time when we get on to fermentation. Right, that's what I was going to talk about wort and making wort. Anyone got any interesting experiences or thoughts to add?
I just wanted to ask about the mash out. Oh, sorry. Like, why do you do a mash out if you're boiling?
It depends how long there's going to be between finishing your mash and getting your boil up to mash temperature again. If you're running it out, your sparge can take 45 minutes, something like that. And if your sparge temp isn't high enough, I mean, your sparge itself, if you're running at 70 odd C, can be your mash out. But if you're doing a batch sparge, you could be dropping the wort out, leaving it with it at a sort of 50 degrees C while you do your batch sparge for another 20 minutes or so. If you're going for a lighter body beer, probably wouldn't bother. But if you're doing something like one of these porters, I might.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to do it mainly because I can. And I know some people say, well, it helps to, by raising it, you more quickly denature the enzymes and everything, so you kind of freezing your mash at that point, so you're stopping any further conversion beyond. I don't know how much difference that makes, because obviously by that time you've probably done all the conversion that's going to happen. And the other side of it is, by raising the temperature, apparently you make the liquid more fluid, so you're going to drain the sugars out better. Again, I don't know. It's just, yeah, I mean, I brew with a grain father, so it's got a functionality there. So I just basically say, yeah, do it, and it raises the temperature for me. So yeah, I haven't really done any experimenting on it, but certainly that's a couple of the arguments people use. I
usually sparge with a higher temp liquor because it's quicker to get it back up to the boil. That's the main reason why I do it. But yeah, and it also stops the mash, doesn't it? So.
Yeah, I mean, if you go straight to a sparge, you're going to get that temperature up fairly fast. I mean, if you're going from 66 and you're sparging it with 76 water, you're going to end up at 72 relatively fast. But if you've got the capability to do it, it makes the calculations, the water addition calculation, a little bit more fiddly, because you've got You got this much to add at this point, this much to add at that point, then you sparge. But if you've got an automated system, it's pretty trivial.
Now, I like dry beers. Drier the better. So, in actual fact, if the sparge takes a bit longer, doesn't matter. If the temperature falls a little, doesn't matter. If the mash goes on a bit long, it's just all drier as far as I'm concerned, and therefore better, subjectively for me.
You can do a chunk of it with recipe selection, initial mash temperatures. So if you your mash is actually running fairly high to start with, you can end up with a bit more body that way. But yeah, if you want a dry beer, don't bother. I mean, I tend to do it for everything apart from pale ales, and sours and things. Actually, some sours I do, some sours I don't. Depends whether I need some long chain stuff left in there.